Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Solid Rock Apologetics. My name is Nick Holzmer, and in this podcast, we are going to be talking about the ancient heresy known as modalism, also called modalistic monarchianism. In short, modalism is the denial of the Holy Trinity and the most common theological error when it comes to the nature of God. For new Christians, or for those who aren't too familiar with the topic, the Holy Trinity refers to one God operating in three persons. The three persons are God the Father, who is Yahweh, God the Son, who is Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit. All one God who operate in three distinct persons who are in communication with each other. Modalism teaches that God operates in different modes or forms, sometimes operating as God the Father, like in the Old Testament, other times operating as God the Son, like in the Gospels, and also as God the Holy Spirit, such as on the day of Pentecost onward to the present day. We see this heresy played out today as the Jesus-only movement, or Oneness Pentecostalism. The cults of Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses denounce the Holy Trinity as well, but we won't be focusing on what they believe in this podcast. Instead, we'll focus mainly on the ancient heresy itself and Oneness Pentecostalism. Modalism got its momentum going around the late 2nd century and early 3rd century under the influence of Praxeas and Sabellius. The majority of church leaders at the time were Trinitarian in their beliefs, and modalism was ultimately condemned as a heresy at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, saying those who espoused modalism cannot be a part of the church. Now, no writings of Praxeas or Sabellius survived because the church condemned their teachings as heretical, and over time, their writings and works were most likely destroyed. This idea that God operates in different forms doesn't work for many reasons. Personally, I would consider it blasphemous because it attacks the very nature of God. John chapter 10, verses 29 through 30 says, "My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." In verse 29, Jesus is talking about God the Father, and he is referring to the Father as another person. In verse 30, where it says, "I and the Father are one," that is not referring to both the Father and the Son being the same person. The context is Jesus saying that he is God and the second person of the Trinity. Acts chapter 1 verse 8 says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." In this verse, Jesus makes it clear that the Holy Spirit is an entirely different person in the Holy Trinity. This makes no indication whatsoever that Jesus changes form on the day of Pentecost. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, the writer of Hebrews is talking about Jesus here. Now he says, "He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high." This tells us that Jesus sits at the right hand of God the Father. If God changes forms, then how could Jesus sit right next to God the Father? John chapter 17 verse 1 says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted his eyes to heaven and said, 'Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you.'" This verse shows that Jesus is speaking to God the Father, and if God just changes forms, then how could Jesus speak to God the Father like he does in this verse? And if God changes form, then Jesus wouldn't need to pray because he'll change from God the Father to God the Son to God the Holy Spirit. Modalists today would tell us that God operates in the mode of Holy Spirit today. If that's the case, then how could Jesus make his second coming possible? If God is operating in the mode of Holy Spirit, that would ultimately mean that Jesus is already back on earth, and it would prove his triumphal entry meaningless because he wouldn't need a triumphal entry because he would already be here. Even though the early church wrote this off as a heresy many centuries ago, that doesn't mean that it went away. This heresy is still very much alive and well today. Groups that hold to modalism today would be the United Pentecostal Church International, United Apostolic Churches, and Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, to name a few. Modalism appears under the guise of Jesus only, oneness, or Oneness Pentecostalism. Today, I would say the two biggest key figures of modalism would be T.D. Jakes and Stephen Furtick. T.D. Jakes has a long history of teaching Oneness Pentecostalism and teaches that God operates in different modes or forms. He also teaches the false prosperity gospel, and he has a huge following. Now, T.D. Jakes is also an idol for Stephen Furtick. Furtick looks up to Jakes like a god, a little g god, and the two of them are very close. Stephen Furtick early in 2020 with the controversial sermon called Ghosted, where he's talking about Jesus ascending into heaven and sending the Holy Spirit. But rather than telling the Bible truth in Acts chapters 1 and 2, where Jesus says that he is sending the Holy Spirit, Furtick says that Jesus is changing forms into the Holy Spirit. In the sermon, Furtick is talking about how the disciples were disappointed that Jesus is going away, and Furtick claims that Jesus told the disciples, I'm going to do my best to impersonate Stephen Furtick here for you guys, I'm not leaving you, I'm changing forms! Yeah, Stephen Furtick did say that. Even though he was called on it, he didn't back down and didn't apologize for it. The Pentecostal movement in general has many key figures in the movement that denounce the Holy Trinity. Now, here are a few examples. Now, these are key figures in like the early Pentecostal movement. These people aren't alive anymore. Charles Parham denounced the Trinity and espoused to Oneness Pentecostal doctrine. Parham also was a teacher of annihilationism, the belief that those who die in their sins are annihilated rather than being tormented in the lake of fire for all eternity, which contradicts Revelation chapter 20. Now, side note here, I will do a podcast on annihilationism in the future. William Branham taught his followers that Trinitarianism is of the devil. And modern Pentecostal and charismatic leaders today, such as Benny Hinn, Bill Johnson, Todd Bentley, and Perry Stone, just to name a few, look up to William Branham as a great man of God. William Branham also prophesied falsely on numerous occasions. The most notable one was the prophecy he gave that the rapture would happen in 1977, followed by the destruction of the world. Well, as of this recording, it is July of 2021. So being that we are 44 years later, I would say he's pretty wrong. Because if that was true, I would never have been born. Early on in the Pentecostal movement, there was a huge split. Many in the movement were Trinitarian, while many others were Oneness. The Assemblies of God is the denomination that formed in 1914 as a result of the split. The Assemblies of God is Trinitarian and is the largest Pentecostal denomination in the world with almost 70 million members. Oneness Pentecostalism also teaches that once members are saved, their salvation is evident by speaking in tongues. And if somebody in their church doesn't speak in tongues, then they must not be saved. This is erroneous for a few reasons, first of which the Apostle Paul makes it clear that not every believer is gifted with this gift. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 29 through 30, Paul gives us the following questions. He asks us, are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? Paul is asking a series of rhetorical questions, and the answer to these rhetorical questions is no. Not every believer is gifted with every spiritual gift. A second reason why this is erroneous is that it is adding works to our salvation. Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8 through 9 and Romans chapter 5 verses 1 through 5 tell us that we are saved by grace and are justified by faith, and works cannot save us. Oneness Pentecostal is telling us that speaking in tongues is required for salvation, is making their process of salvation a works-based one. A third reason why this is erroneous is that it allows for the abuse of the gift. We will get more into the abuse of the gift in another podcast, but requiring speaking in tongues for salvation, and a person who doesn't get it, it can lead a person to do one of two things. The first reason is that the person could fake the gift, which could be quite easily done, or it can lead a person to doubt their salvation without a valid reason. As you can clearly see, modalism didn't die off centuries ago when it was labeled a heresy, but it is still very much alive and well in many Pentecostal churches today. If you find yourself in a Oneness Pentecostal church, I would encourage you to leave and find a solid Bible preaching church. It is my prayer that you grow in your faith in Jesus and that you develop an understanding of the nature of God. God bless you all, and have a great night.